Okay, here we are again. This is Regents Review number 5. And this is Mrs. Russolello. Okay, here we go. First question. Find the inverse of f of x is equal to the square root of x minus 7, where f of x is greater than or equal to negative 7. Okay, so we're going to start by making a graph. Okay, so if we were to graph this, it would be starting at negative 7, and it would be looking something like that. We know when we find the inverse graphically that it's a reflection over the y equals x line. So that means that I would have to go over here, start at negative 7, and it would look something like that. Okay, everything looks good there. But now we need the equation of the line, or the curve in this case. So we know whenever we find the inverse, we need to first set it up in terms of y equals. So y equals the square root of x minus 7. And we want to swap the x and the y, because that is how you find the inverse, right? Then we have to get the y by itself. So we're going to add 7 to both sides, and we get that the square root of x, or the square root of y actually, is equal to x plus 7. Now we need to get rid of that square root, so we're going to square both sides. So we get that y is equal to x plus 7 quantity squared. Now, it doesn't say to represent this as a trinomial, so we could just leave it that way. And we should actually, unless they ask us to represent the inverse as a trinomial. If they did, remember we can use their identity and say that that's equal to square the first, double the product, and then square the last. Okay, but we don't really need to do that in this case. However, if we were to graph this, it's a quadratic, right? So a quadratic, we know, is represented as a parabola. So it would look something like this. But we don't want that whole parabola. We only want this section over here. So that means we have to put a restriction on our inverse. So the final answer is going to be the inverse of f of x is going to be equal to x plus 7 quantity squared, such that x is greater than or equal to negative 7. Notice that the range of the original f of x changed to the domain of the inverse of f of x. Okay, and that would be our answer. Okay, on to number 2. Now number 2 gives us two functions, h of n and g of n. H of n is equal to n plus 2, and g of n is equal to 2n plus 1. And we need to find h of n minus g of n. So this is simply subtraction. So we're going to replace h of n with its equivalent, which is n plus 2, and we're going to replace g of n with 2n plus 1. Now remember, we're going to have to distribute that negative, so we end up with n plus 2 minus 2n minus 1. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and combine like terms, and we get negative n plus 1. And that is our final answer. All right, going on to number 3. Now number 3 asks for that average rate of change. Now average rate of change is just another word or another phrase that means the slope. Okay, so we know the slope is equal to the change of y over the change of x. So what we need here is we need two coordinates, x1 and y1, and x2 and y2. Okay, so if we were to write that out, this is what it would look like. So here we are given the domain. We know that the domain are the x's, so we have our x1 and our x2. And we need to find what our y1 and y2 are. So we want a little table here, and we know that x1 is -1 and x2 is 2. So we're going to go ahead and you can either substitute the -1 in for your x here, or you can simply put this into y equals and get your values. So I already put them in, and I know that the value here is going to be 10, and my y2 is going to be 28. Now, if you didn't do that, remember, you're going to put this into y equals on your calculator, or you can go ahead and substitute the -1 in for x, and then the -2, and then the +2 in for x. Find f of -1 is equal to 10, and f of 2 is equal to 28. Now we can go ahead and substitute that in. So we have 28 minus 10 divided by 2 minus -1, which is equal to 18 divided by 3, which is 6. So the average rate of change is equal to 6. For this function. Okay, on to number 4. All right, so a meteorologist drew the accompanying graph to show the changes in relative humidity during a 24-hour period in New York City. All right, and we're asked to find the domain and the range. Now we know by definition the domain are the x values or the inputs. On the graph, that can be found along the x-axis. So the minimum x is 0 here, and the maximum x value is 24. So that becomes our domain. So our domain goes from 0 to 24. And I wrote that incorrectly. These are supposed to be reversed. And I would do the whole video over again, but I've done this about 17 times already because I kept messing up. So here you go. All right. So now we want to look at our y values, which would be our range. Now our minimum y is here, and our maximum y goes all the way up to here. So our minimum is 30, and our maximum is 80. So that means our range is going to go from 30 all the way up to 80. Okay, and there you go. That is our domain and our range. Okay, on to the last question. Now this question asks for 3 different pieces: the y-intercept, f of -1, and f of 10. Now I know that the y-intercept is equivalent to f of 0. So really I need to find f of 0, f of -1, and f of 10. So f of 0, f of -1, and f of 10. Okay, so f of 0. Now this is a piecewise function. So piecewise functions, we can see, have intervals. So the interval is here. And we know that the intervals are always the x values. And then we have our y values over here. How do we find our y value? We substitute our x into the equation to get our matching y. So f of 0, the first thing we have to do is find out where is 0 in this interval. Which interval does it fall into? So f of 0 would fall between -2 and +2. So I'm going to substitute in my 0 into this equation. So f of 0 would be equal to 0 minus 2, which is equal to -2, which is the x-intercept, the y-intercept. So the y-intercept is at -2. Now I want to find f of -1. Well, it turns out that -1 is in between -2 and +2 as well. So I'm going to substitute that into the same interval equation and get -3. All right, and now I just have f of 10. Now f of 10 does not fall into that interval because 10 is greater than or equal to 2. So I'm going to substitute 10 into this equation. So now I have -2 times 10 plus 4, which is equal to a -16. So my last one, f of 10, is equal to -16. So I've answered all 3 questions of number 5. Okay, so we're done now. I hope you found this helpful. And I'm going to try and get out of here without messing up too much. Okay, see you guys later, and hope you have a good rest of the break. And if you're already back at school, continue studying.